So in this process, step one was just to get the podcast template working again in its original form. So I created the Next.js 13 project using the experimental app support, which is for React Server components, and then I put the template in here. So the site is running. My goal was to get it running in this, experimental form of Next.js in its original form. And the great news is this worked flawlessly. I didn't have to do anything, just copied the code in and ran it. And so that's cool because it means that it's backwards compatible. And step two then was to convert as much as possible to React Server components. And the approach I took was just taking the old pages directory and renaming it to app. So in Next.js 13, React Server component stuff goes in the app directory, and pages is kind of like legacy. So I just renamed it from pages to app and ran the project, and I was like, all right, let's see what breaks, And it was cool. It seemed like you could incrementally do this as well. So at one point, I tested out having a mix of stuff in the pages and the app directory, and you could link between them, and they seem to work seamlessly together. So you don't necessarily need to take this approach of just moving everything over. You could do it incrementally, and that's really cool. I think that's definitely a good way to do this, and it'll make it much easier to upgrade existing sites. But anyways, back to my experiment where I just moved everything over. A lot of things broke, but it was pretty easy to tell what broke, which is important whenever you're doing this kind of thing. For the most part, it was just like these errors that are like, hey, you can't use context or use state or whatever hook inside a server component. So it was pretty straightforward, like, okay, this isn't going to work. But then what I did is I was like, I just want to get it working again. So I went through and converted everything that was broken to a client component, just by adding the use client annotation to anything that was broken. And it took a little bit of, minor amount of refactoring and stuff, but for the most part, it was that simple. I just added use client to a bunch of stuff, and it got the site working again. It was great. It was like, okay, cool. So we're making progress. At this point, some things are running as React Server components. Most of it's still client components, but that's fine. We're making progress. Incremental progress. That's the way I like to do things, keep it running, keep it working, work your way through it, right? Of course, this is when, we get into the hard part, the nitty gritty, we have to actually sort of analyze the site and figure out, okay, if I did some refactoring, what could I sort of make as the minimum amount of components that needed to be client components? So essentially convert as much as possible to React Server components. You might not necessarily need to do this in all cases. It depends on what you're trying to do, but for the sake of me experimenting, this is what I wanted to do. Let's see how much of this I can run as server components, right? So I went through the source and identified the parts of the site that actually needed to be client side. For example, the template includes this really cool audio player that will just like play episodes in the background as you navigate through the site. Not just like while you're on one page, like you can navigate between pages and it'll keep playing your audio. This meant the audio player needed a context. And contexts have to be client side, right? The context will keep track of what's playing and your position and, allow you to pause and, play a new track or whatever, right? So I extracted just the context and the sort of functions around it into a new client component that only included the client side specific bits. There's also like some browser API stuff here that you have to interact with the play media and that kind of thing. This is all client side only. It doesn't exist on the server. So, it just doesn't make sense to do this any other way, right? So I extracted this into its own file. And that went well. And I also need to talk about a feature of Next.js 13. I don't know if they introduced this before. They might have, but in Next.js 13 with server components, they have this thing called a layout file. So essentially, a layout file is like a normal page, component, file, whatever, but it spans multiple pages. So you would use it for normally like navigation, headers, footers, things that stay basically the same as you're navigating between the pages on your site, or at least a subset of pages on your site. So I created this layout file, and I moved and I had that layout file reference the context client component. This way it would include this context on all the pages in my site. And so the layout itself is a server component, and it includes this client component, and it all just worked. It was actually pretty easy. And at this point, I could run the site and have my context and have the player available on all the pages. So even though it was getting included on a server component page, it was pretty easy to include on all the other pages. So that's nothing groundbreaking, but hey, it worked. It's cool. And that's the approach I took. The site continued to work. And at this point, I had isolated the context part of the audio player, and it's included on all the pages. So we're making good progress. Of course, I did mention that part of the context was interfacing with some browser APIs for playback, but there's the entire sort of audio player itself that also needs to be client side because of using browser only APIs, and because it also uses events. You click a button and it starts playback and stuff like that, which can only be in client components. And honestly, I converted it, and the process was, essentially similar, except I didn't need to put it in a layout file. I just put it in a normal, component and included it on some of the pages. So it was basically just identifying these things that needed to be client-side specific, moving them into a new file that had the used client annotation. It did require a bit of work, because a lot of times I found things that were client-specific stuff were mixed with things that could be rendered server-side. So if you're doing this yourself, you don't necessarily have to go this extreme approach of, putting as much on, to be rendered server-side as possible, right? But that's what I wanted to do, right? Try it out. So it did take some work to sort of separate these things and create new components, and but it wasn't too bad, I suppose. It wasn't too difficult, but it would totally depend on how interwoven these things are in your project. I could see this being extremely time consuming. But the bright side is, you don't necessarily need to do it at once. It looks like you could, for a lot of things, do it incrementally. Again, if you designed your project badly and you have a bunch of spaghetti code, it's not going to be easy. You're going to have to kind of do it all at once. It'll be a nightmare, but that's how working with that kind of code is. So, I don't think this is anything new. All right. So now there was one more thing I needed to convert, and to me, kind of the most interesting thing, and that was the data fetching. So the way I wanted to set this up is to have the website fetch the RSS feed and some other data from some other places that I had it, whether it's on the server or wherever. Anyways, it's got to fetch some data, right? So I was still doing this client side using the normal way we fetch stuff client side, right? But I really wanted to see what this was like to do it server side. And in the documentation for all this, they basically really super encourage you to do all your data fetching in server components. So I'm I got to try this out. Is it really better? Is it good? What is it for? Right? I have a lot of questions. I want to figure this out. So I went through and did that, and it wasn't too difficult. It required a little bit more refactoring again to move some of the data fetching stuff into new components, blah, blah, blah. I mean, the drill, components, moving, refactoring, right? But the cool thing was this actually allowed me to remove a lot of code, just in general. So before, there were hooks, being used to fetch the data. The normal pattern, like your component renders and you have a use effect that subscribes to data fetches data, whatever. It fetches the data. Then you're going to have a re-render. And the refactored version didn't need any of this. The hooks were all gone and all the loading states were gone, because the refactored version for the React Server components, you can just, you don't have to have a use effect. You don't have to have hooks. Just in the rendering of your component, you can just await and fetch the data, using the fetch API. It's so much simpler. Oh my goodness. I loved this part of it. It was like, wow, this is really easy. Something that was sort of complicated before is just super simple now. It's just await, fetch data, process the data, display it. I love this. This is so much easier to work with. We're going to talk more about some, complications around this later on. It's not all, peaches and strawberries, or I don't know, whatever the saying happens to be. But like, I don't know, like compared to the old code, this was just like just better. Like, I don't know any other way to say it. Simpler, better, easier to work with. And, it doesn't necessarily mean there's less re-rendering. That also depends on loading states you might want to show, that kind of thing. And it could actually be slower, depending on how you were fetching your data. We're going to talk more about this later, but it could mean an extra server is involved, since the data, might not actually be stored on the server that's rendering the component and that kind of thing. So I'm definitely going to talk more about this at the later stages of the show. We're going to get through the actual sort of process first here. But yeah, so that was really cool. And now I had a site that was completely converted with, only the stuff that needed to be client-side, inside client-side only components, and the rest were just sort of unannotated, which means by default they're a server component, but you can use them client-side too, as long as you're not, using something that can only be done on the server. So the await fetch thing I was talking about, that can only be done in server components. But a lot of the components, they don't do anything that's like client-side or server-side specific. So you could use them in both, places. You could use them as a client-side component or a server-side component. But yeah, most of my components, it seems from looking at the output, they are server components. They get rendered server-side. Awesome. So at this point, I would say, yeah, the conversion was complete and working. Of course, the next step was to actually deploy this and see how that went. And that also ended up being a bit of an adventure. So I originally tried to deploy it to Vercel. Vercel is the company that creates Next.js. And they provide a service where they'll basically just handle all the deployment for you. You give them your source code and they do extra fancy stuff like, edge nodes and whatever, all for you automatically. Well, it didn't really work well at all. So it ran and I could deploy it. I ran into numerous weird issues where pages weren't loading, or not loading correctly, or partially loading, it would load, it had the layout stuff was there and it would I don't know, it was really weird, navigating between things. It just seemed really broken. I eventually found some of it was known bugs and required upgrading to an alpha version of Next.js to fix it. And I tried that, and it did fix some things, but not everything. There were just weird things and I just didn't trust it. And what seemed weird to me is that if I built the site and ran it locally, like a production build, I didn't run into these same issues. So I thought the problem was actually with how Vercel was deploying it, not necessarily Next.js itself. So then I deployed it on my own server, and sure enough, it all just worked. So yeah, definitely right now, Vercel is not ready for React server components, and at least, I don't know, using their default setup, I'm sure it's still a work in progress, but yeah, that does not work. But yeah, running it yourself seems usable. And, like I said, you're welcome to check it out. Let me know if you find any issues. Maybe there's stuff I missed, but just doing a normal production build seemed to work. All right, so I did notice some issues though so everything did work technically, but along the way I added my own feature that adds paging. So on the main page, you would go to the reactshow.com, and by default it was loading all 75 episodes, and it just seemed like it was loading a lot for the home page, the initial page people might be going to. If you're on slow internet, that would take a while. And I was like, that's not really necessary. We can show the most recent ones and have a link to the rest. And so I created a paging system, just a normal run-of-the-mill paging system where you pass the page as a query parameter. So page equals 1, page equals 2, some buttons, pretty standard stuff, right? But it worked fine in development mode, but I noticed when I ran this in production mode, I started running into issues. So I ran into some issues. I would get this error page switch from static to dynamic or whatever. And I'm like, oh, that's weird. Why? I don't understand. And then sometimes I wouldn't get errors. It would just not work right. So it turns out I'm using the Next.js API to pass in the query params. This is part of their page API, even in the new version, right? But it seems like Next is unable to detect using query params, or what they call search params. And so Next doesn't know that the page needs to be dynamic. So in Next.js, you can have static pages and dynamic pages. A static page, it just renders it at build time ahead of time and just serves static content, right? Dynamic is a page that, gets a request, and then on the server, it processes and, creates the page dynamically at runtime. And because I'm using this paging system where it's page 1, page 2, page 3, I have different content that gets rendered depending on what page you're on. So in my head, I'm like, Next.js should be detecting this and, it should know this is a dynamic page. Well, that doesn't work. It definitely doesn't know. And so yeah, sure enough, looking at the build output, it was oh no, it's calling this a static page. It just doesn't know. I don't know if that's a bug, if they're planning on support it. I don't really know the situation, but that's what I ran into. And I don't know, playing around with it more, it just seems like Next.js currently is just assuming way too much stuff is a static page. Nearly everything was a static page, even when I don't think it should have been. And it, depending on how you fetch data in your server components, it's also supposed to do some sort of, I don't know if it's not maybe called a dynamic page, but it will regenerate your static pages. Anyways, the whole thing seems a bit buggy. And to fix this, I just had to add annotations to a number of my pages to mark them as dynamic pages. This sucks. This will absolutely bite you in production. I don't like this at all. This seems like terrible design, relying on annotations at the top of the file. It smells like bad design to me. This isn't, I don't think this is really a React thing, but more of a Next.js thing, but they definitely need to figure out a better way to do this and more correctly detect things. I don't know if this is planned. I have no idea. Maybe they know about this and I'm just using an alpha feature and that's fine. Whatever. I'm just noting it. And yeah, the truth is, if I had written more tests up front, I might have caught that. But good design, that doesn't rely on tests. You should have tests to catch things, but that doesn't mean you have good design. In fact, if you need tests to catch things, that probably means you have bad design. Anyways, now I have a fully working and deployed website with React Server Components. I got all those issues figured out. Everything works. And yeah, so that was basically the whole process. And now